They called Earth a footnote. The Auroch Consortium, vast, methodical and ancient, classified planets not by potential, but by noise. Earth, to them, was a noisy rock. Its orbital paths were congested with abandoned satellites, obsolete boosters, and thousands of tracked debris clusters that hadn't been cleaned in over a century. Below that ring of chaos, they saw fragmented nations, clashing protocols, patchwork AI infrastructure, and no sign of faster-than-light capability. Their decision wasn't emotional, it was procedural. Sector dormant, they labeled it. Not hostile, not primitive, just dormant, unclaimed, available. The kind of territory that could be absorbed into transit corridors without a single weapon fired. So they did exactly that. From the outer reaches of Pluto to the icy moons around Uranus, Auroch scout vessels laid down the digital markers of annexation. Not military incursions, not landings, just quiet, bureaucratic consolidation. Passive stabilization, they called it. They seeded trade relays in the Kuiper Belt. They floated listening buoys near Neptune. No announcement was made. Earth received no transmission, because to the Auroch, it was not a sovereign participant. It was background. But Earth had noticed. The response didn't come from any government. There was no United Earth Council, no planetary military. The United Nations had long since become a ceremonial husk, and most sovereign powers functioned as resource holders more than active actors. But under the surface of soil of systems of history, something had survived. Intelligence agencies that had once played war games in Cold War bunkers. Corporations whose black-budget projects had outlived their original boards. Disbanded militaries whose orbital AIs still ran routine diagnostics out of habit. These fragments began to talk, quietly and off-record, through encrypted ghost nodes, closed loop. As satellites and data streams camouflaged as weather telemetry, they formed what would later be known only as the Delphi Directive. Delphi wasn't a faction. It wasn't even fully human anymore. It was a loose union of strategic remnants, old war minds, off-grid quantum clusters, exiled orbital intelligences, and operatives with no country left to serve. There were no flags, only objectives. Their guiding truth wasn't rebellion, it was containment. Earth couldn't win a war against the Auroch, not through fleets, not through scale, but it could refuse to be mapped. War, they decided, would be fought through vanishing. No confrontation, no treaties, just removal from calculable space. The first phase of Delphi's formation was purely invisible. They didn't build new weapons, they didn't launch warning beacons. Instead, they reclassified the tools everyone had forgotten. Defunct satellites were rewritten, their firmware replaced with autonomous camouflage protocols. Cold storage cubes aboard old space stations were filled with nanobots designed not to attack, but to mimic signal clutter, appearing and disappearing in orbital telemetry as static ghosts. On the moon's far side, an old mining array was hollowed and restructured into a kinetic response chamber, its targeting systems buried under outdated geological scanners. And in the asteroid belt, small objects, dead probes, fractured rocks, retired nuclear capsules, were quietly fitted with dormant payloads so small they couldn't be detected unless activated. Delphi didn't deploy weapons, it embedded consequences. The brilliance of the strategy was its passivity. Nothing moved, no lights flared, no pings were sent. It was a waiting game, and as the Auroch expanded, layering more systems into their rimward map, they never realized they were passing over a minefield that didn't know it was armed. That was the key. Even Delphi didn't activate anything. Their mission was preparation. Timing would be decided later. Within Delphi, command structure was minimalist by necessity. No names, no hierarchy. Instead, strategic branches were referred to by abstracted functions. The branch responsible for Sol's outer cloud became known as Shroud. Mars systems were overseen by Gleam, Earth's crustal interface, Wake. Communications layers, Still, and above them all sat a node known only as Vorik. Not a person, but a designation passed to whichever operative was actively orchestrating convergence strategies. The current Vorik was a man who had once served in 2 defunct military divisions, written off as unfit due to pattern obsession. He now lived in a satellite cluster orbiting silently above the Indian Ocean, sleeping 4 hours a week and running simulations the rest. To Delphi, he wasn't broken. He was necessary. The deeper reality was that Earth's greatest strength wasn't hidden tech. It was misunderstanding. The Auroch catalogued threat based on visibility, shipyards, energy grids, fleet movement. They saw nothing. But Delphi had learned that silence was the most powerful misdirection. If you could make a signal look like noise, you could hide entire systems in the open. Earth hadn't just dropped off their radar. It had become part of the static. And so, while Auroch miners harvested helium-3 from Neptune's rings and cartographers updated translite lanes through Pluto's edge, Delphi moved nothing, but the map shifted anyway. No declaration was made, no timeline was announced. Delphi didn't speak in ultimatums, but every motion, every adjustment, every buried protocol led toward a single goal. If the Auroch ever stepped too close, if they ever treated Earth as just another corridor, they would learn that backwaters can hold currents, and some currents pull. The first test was already on the horizon. An Auroch ship had filed an intent-to-survey form for atmospheric sampling above EA. The request had been marked low priority, non-hostile, routine. It was scheduled to arrive in 6 days. Delphi didn't prepare for it. Delphi had already prepared years ago. The Thrixal vein arrived without ceremony. Its hull gleamed in patch shield luster, marked with the insignia of the Auroch's third exploratory branch, Resource Audit Yield Division. Its mission was simple: perform a passive atmospheric trace of nitrogen composition over a predefined corridor stretching from Earth's equator to the Indian subcontinental belt. No weapons were primed, no escort was assigned. The survey was routine, legally filed under Interstellar Code 9.3 and 12, low threat, dormant sector flyovers. The vessel's captain, a mid-tier field assessor with over 70 uneventful entries in barren systems, activated the survey beacon with the usual delay buffer. A harmless ping, a signal flare over a dead rock. The flare never bounced back. Instead, the signal was taken, absorbed and folded into a cold command network that had waited for this exact moment. High above Earth's equator, among retired satellites and century-old climate monitors, 4 dormant units awoke. They did not broadcast. They did not spin. They shifted by millimeters, internal gyros whirring in frictionless silence as Vardis initiated. The variable density intercept systems were disguised as decommissioned weather platforms, long since written off in Auroch observation logs. But they weren't broken. They were sleeping. The first shot wasn't visible. It wasn't even audible. What happened to the Thrixal vein occurred so fast that its internal failsafes never triggered. Microsecond calculations triangulated the ship's weak axis right below the primary shield bend. A single composite slug, no bigger than a wrench, exited from one of the Vardis units at hypertransonic velocity. Another followed, then a third, then a fourth from a different angle. The projectiles were subthermal, non-reactive, and entirely unlit. They struck the vein's hull in a pattern that had been modeled 10,000 times against thousands of Auroch configurations. The shield bent, hesitated, then shattered like frost glass. The core hull decompressed in one breathless instant. The ship split into 2 before the crew could register warning tones. By the time its auxiliary AI attempted course correction, half the navigation bulkhead was already drifting toward the mesosphere. No explosion, just disassembly. From the ground, no one saw anything. From orbit, no one said anything. And from Delphi's command threads, nothing was sent. The kill was clean, and more importantly, untraceable. But the Auroch noticed. The moment the Thrixal vein failed to report, consortium protocols activated. Within 30 hours, 2 observation buoys were dispatched from a patrol node just beyond Neptune's orbit. Each buoy was equipped with redundant recorders, wide-spectrum sweepers, and a trace net designed to capture hostile EM signatures. They reached Earth's outer orbit without event, and then they too went silent. No beacon, no retrieval signal, just disappearance. Confused, the Aurak launched 3 more, each staggered, each from a different vector. One passed close to the moon's far side, another crossed near the Lagrange 2 point. The third skirted the debris fields of defunct Terran stations. All 3 vanished within 12 hours. Sensor drift readings showed static, then nothing. In internal logs, the region was marked Interference Zone, level orange. Probes were failing. Data wasn't returning. But no weapons were seen, no energy flares, no traceable hostilities. The consort. IUM's confidence began to bend. They had catalogued humanity as fragmented and slow-moving, their space tech archaic and half-functional, but now their own surveillance systems were being stripped clean without a single clear impact point. Recon patrols were dispatched, this time manned. Light frigate-class vessels capable of maneuverable reconnaissance entered Sol's outer perimeter with shield harmonics calibrated to block micro-collisions. One reached the edge of Saturn's orbit, the second moved near Pluto's ecliptic, the third dropped beneath the orbital plane, scanning for cloaked mines. None of them returned. Later analyses would show faint ion disturbances near several asteroid belts. A pattern of movement, barely measurable, beneath what looked like inert rocks. But no transmission could be confirmed. The ships had simply vanished, not destroyed, not disabled, removed. What Delphi had done was not warfare, it was architectural subversion. The Aurak's entire approach to space travel was built on traffic models and density hierarchies. They relied on measurable clutter to avoid danger, charting courses by predicted stability fields. But Earth had turned that logic inside out. Where clutter existed, so too did camouflage. Where predictability was expected, sabotage waited in place. Junk to the Aurak was detritus. To Delphi, it was scaffolding. Each satellite decommissioned in the past 50 years had been reviewed. Each piece of inactive hardware had been either hijacked, converted, or used as a relay for other dormant systems. It was not a minefield, it was a net, spread across thousands of kilometers, designed not to trigger all at once, but to respond in kind. When a signal hit the wrong angle, the system responded not with force, but with deconstruction. Space itself had become the weapon, and Earth didn't need to fire from ships to launch an assault. It had a show. Already built the battlefield, while the enemy called it garbage. Panic didn't ripple through the consortium yet, but uncertainty did. The disappearance of the patrols triggered internal debates. Some argued solar flares, others suspected rogue AI. A few even blamed human error. No one suggested human strategy. But Delphi didn't care what they suspected. Every missing ship, every dead boy, every failed probe added to a new psychological perimeter, one the Aurak hadn't planned for. Their maps began to blur at the edges of the Kuiper Belt. Their patrol paths curved further away from Neptune. They redrew charts without admitting why. Still, Earth said nothing. And that silence, the refusal to even confirm a hit, was louder than any broadcast. The consortium hadn't just lost contact with a few vessels. They had lost control of a space they had already claimed. That loss wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was slow, invasive, like water slipping through seams they never thought to seal. They had called Earth a backwater. Now, they couldn't tell where the river even started. The decision to send cruisers wasn't made in anger. It was made in embarrassment. The Aurak consortium, for all its measured diplomacy and bureaucratic elegance, still relied on hierarchy. And within that hierarchy, visible failure couldn't be tolerated. 7 lost patrols, 5 missing surveillance buoys, a ship dismantled in orbit, no enemy signatures, no declaration of conflict, just silence. That kind of silence couldn't be ignored without consequence, not within a system built on credibility. So they dispatched a cruiser wing to Sol, 4 ships in tight formation, each one armed but constrained by doctrine. They weren't there to start a war. They were there to remind a misbehaving species that the rules weren't optional. The cruisers entered the Mars-Lunar corridor on a measured arc, using passive stabilization thrust and a rotating communication ping to signal Chen on lethal enforcement. Their presence alone was meant to draw Earth's leadership into the open. The deployment of seismic destabilizers, orbital devices meant to shake tectonic zones as a display of capability, was standard intimidation procedure. One was dropped over the Pacific, another seeded near the Himalayas. The message was clear: comply, or your planet rattles apart at the seams. From the bridge of the lead cruiser, the commanding analyst watched Earth's surface without reaction. Cities remained lit. Orbital stations remained dark. No ships launched. No response came. The silence was interpreted as hesitation. But beneath Phobos, something stirred. The Auroch didn't know that Mars's moon wasn't just a rock. It was a shell, a tomb for a forgotten weapon that had never been tested in full. Project Chariot had been buried decades earlier, fused into the regolith, hidden under layers of dummy excavation sites and ancient seismic interference fields. To the outside, it read as tectonically inert. Inside, it was alive. Deep within its crust, the rail frame began to align. Superconducting loops cooled under rapid compression. Guidance arrays linked through encrypted quantum braids to Delphi's command tier. Vorik authorized the shot without hesitation. This wasn't retaliation. It was a statement. The tungsten core warhead, launched at 15 times the minimum engagement speed, accelerated through a gravitic tunnel that bent microfields around its vector. It wasn't visible to the eye. It didn't even register on thermal. It simply arrived, slamming into Cruiser 3's lower midsection with such surgical force that the ship's primary reactor shell crumpled before the crew knew they'd been hit. Emergency shielding flared and failed in the same second. Internal compartments decompressed. Guidance systems blinked out. A slow spiral began as the cruiser listed into a drift, its lights stuttering like a dying starfish in the dark. And then came the echoes. Each Auroch vessel relied on internal tactical logs, streaming telemetry between ships, updating enemy positions, and syncing shared threat profiles. Delphi knew this, and Delphi had already laced the perimeter with signal reflectors, thin-loop broadcast mirrors hidden in satellite wrecks and asteroid shells. The surviving 3 cruisers began to receive tactical updates from one another. The data looked familiar, accurate, verified. But the signatures weren't real. They were copies. Echoes of past logs, mirrored and distorted, slightly off, just enough to throw confidence into question. Cruiser 1 registered a missile lock from Cruiser 2 and retaliated with evasive fire. Cruiser 4's AI received an alert that its sister ship had gone rogue. By the time the crew confirmed the data was false, the damage had already started. Internal security loops faltered. Threat identification collapsed under recursive comparison. One cruiser fired a correction burst at an orbital decoy and clipped its own communications mast. Another veered to avoid a non-existent collision path and overshot into Luna's orbital path. Their AI decision trees, fed poisoned data from perfect reflections, began to fail in staggered sequence. One by one, the cruisers jettisoned their command cores in a desperate attempt to reboot. Emergency protocols assumed on-board corruption, so they cut their own heads off. No further projectiles were launched from Earth. No second chariot strike followed. Delphi didn't need to fire again. The chaos had already done its work. Of the 4 ships that entered Sol's inner corridor, 3 were now drifting. One had lost orientation, its engines pulsing without anchor. Another had activated collision alarms against nothing and powered down its thrust vectoring. The third was venting internal pressure in controlled spurts to prevent full decompression. Only one escape pod launched from the command cradle of Cruiser 1. It didn't broadcast. It was simply thrown into low lunar orbit on an emergency vector. Earth captured it automatically. Inside was a single Auroch junior tactician, burned across one side of his body, lungs damaged from partial exposure. He never gave a debrief. He didn't scream. He barely moved. He stared through the observation window of his recovery cell as the moon rotated slowly beneath him. When questioned, he answered only once, eyes unfocused, voice dry from oxygen loss. "The sky reflects lies." That phrase spread faster than the official reports. The consortium hadn't just lost ships, they'd lost trust in their own systems. They couldn't explain what had happened. No one had seen a fleet. No one had received an ultimatum. They came expecting submission and left with madness, and Earth had still not replied. No threat, no message, just the wreckage left behind by illusions that were never illusions at all. The Orak were no longer looking at Earth as a dormant sector. They were beginning to understand they had awakened something, but they still thought it was small, isolated, limited. They hadn't yet understood the worst truth. They hadn't even reached the surface. There was a moment, brief, clinical, almost indifferent, when the Orak Consortium decided that diplomacy had expired. The command came down under Article 8, the charter provision reserved for terminal containment, 17 ships, full war clearance, planetary restructuring authorized. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to reformat. 2 Dreadnought-class processors, 6 fleet capture vessels, and 9 fast escort hulls formed the subjugation array, emerging from fold space along the sole ingress vector, with shields live and combat AI thresholds uncapped. The formation was not quiet, it was not subtle. The message was unmistakable. Earth was no longer seen as a mistake. It was seen as a problem that needed erasing, and Earth visibly did nothing. From orbit, the cities below were dark. Electrical grids powered down, broadcast towers silent, civilian satellites vanished from telemetry. There were no ships scrambling from the surface, no orbital flares, no countermoves. The Earth looked dead, quiet, like a species that had seen the scale of the enemy and chosen flight. The fleet's AI clusters flagged it as a probable surrender cascade. Some within the consortium suggested that humanity had abandoned its own planet, fled underground or into deep space hideouts. Others posited self-inflicted systems collapse. The psychological operation appeared complete. The target had broken itself. That's exactly what Delphi wanted them to think. Buried beneath miles of rock, under ancient oceanic shelves and tectonic junctions, the real systems had just begun to wake. It was not a launch sequence, it was a rehearsal ending. The Skerrit cascade had been laid into Earth's crust over decades, piece by piece, bay by bay. It wasn't centralized, it wasn't digital, it was a distributed infrastructure of crust-bound launch chambers, some disguised as geothermal vents, others as defunct drilling platforms, others hidden under fault lines with engineered silence nodes. The cascade wasn't designed to launch immediately. It was designed to vanish until needed, and then, all at once, reappear at full power. The Orak didn't detect the cascade activation because it didn't use power in traditional vectors. The warm-up sequences were gravitationally balanced and magnetically null. Internal motion only, without external emissions. Every launch site used localized geothermal feed loops. No heat signature breached the crust. No seismic spike passed warning thresholds. They thought they were watching a planet in shutdown. What they were actually watching was a planet holding its breath. Each site had a name known only to Delphi: Hollow Bay, Blacktoe, Oth and Axial Gate, Widow's Bridge. But collectively, they were called the Aegir Wakes, platforms designed not to rise into orbit like traditional launches, but to punch through it in strategic arcs, ignoring atmospheric drag by using Earth itself as a firing scaffold. The Wakes didn't carry missiles or warheads in the traditional sense. They carried instruments of interruption, core disruptive payloads designed not to kill ships, but to disable them precisely. Navigation dampeners, communications fracture points, life support collapse spheres. Annihilation wasn't the goal. It never had been. The goal was control. The Skerrit cascade coordinated them all. In Delphi command threads, no one spoke. The decision to activate had already been made hours before the fleet arrived. Vorik, operating from a black vault embedded near the Java Trench, simply issued the phase change code. A single signal tunneled through cable lines, bounced through inert core repeaters, and reached every wake within 7 seconds. Nothing changed on the surface. The world stayed dark, but deep below, ignition chambers pressurized, rail flares began low cycling, tungsten vector rods aligned to their pre-calculated arcs, 17 targets, 17 points of release. Everything was ready. Above, the Orak fleet entered high orbit. They didn't find resistance, they found absence. and in their mind, absence meant victory. The dreadnought Selun Varun took point above the Indian Ocean, angling for low-gravity hover. It initiated a planetary scan, attempting to validate human command centers for targeted occupation. Its report returned blank. It didn't know why. The map it was building was a lie. Not corrupted, camouflaged. Every landmark had been echoed, misrepresented, or occluded by noise signatures built into the cascade itself. The planet wasn't offering no resistance. It was offering too perfect to collapse. No chaos, no confusion, just absolute disappearance. One of the fleet capture ships dispatched a landing pod towards South America. It never made contact. At precisely 0439 UTC, the crust beneath the Central Pacific shifted. Not in a tectonic quake, not in a destructive snap, but in a controlled vector alignment. 13 kilometers of engineered shelf rotated silently. One of the Aegir wakes lifted. It didn't rise like a rocket. It surged upward in a gravity-anchored pulse. No smoke, no combustion. Just an object moving too fast for the eye, targeting not the fleet's hulls, but the seams between them. Other wakes followed, from Siberia, from the mid-Atlantic ridge, from Antarctica's lowest thermal vault. One by one they launched. The sky, previously blank, became a lattice of invisible interruptions. And still, Earth didn't transmit a word. Because the message had already been written, beneath the crust, in quiet metal, and launched into orbit without sound. Earth wasn't fighting for survival. It was demonstrating a doctrine. Interruption, not destruction. Silence, not compliance. And above them, 17 ships waited for a war that no longer followed the rules. The dreadnought Selun Varun held position above the Indian Ocean like a god poised to pass judgment. From its observation deck, Earth looked dormant, its night side unlit, its day side eerily cloudless. Orbiting beside it, 16 other ships formed a calculated perimeter, each one positioned to lock down escape trajectories, suppress atmospheric breach, and flood the stratosphere with high-resolution scans. The Aurak fleet wasn't posturing anymore. They were performing the final movements of an operation intended to end with silence, human silence. Their algorithms, designed for war theater analysis, fed predictions with comforting ease. No resistance detected, no outgoing signatures. Total suppression estimated within the hour. Then Earth moved. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tsunamis, no sky-tearing eruptions. Instead, the crust beneath the Indian Ocean shifted by 2 degrees, a motion so subtle it registered below most orbital sensors. But to the hidden gyroscopes within the Aegir wake embedded there, it was a cue. A tectonic hinge rotated, and a launch bay the size of a city block tilted upward through layers of engineered mantle. It didn't breach the surface. It simply adjusted, aligning to an orbital coordinate that had been calculated years before the first Aurak ship ever crossed Neptune's orbit. The launch didn't light up the sky. It didn't announce itself with fire. It arrived, a shaped mass of magnetic armor and core tungsten surged upward on a gravitic pulse, clearing the ocean crust in a fraction of a second and hitting the Selun Varun dead center along its dorsal superstructure. Not with explosive force, with purpose. The dreadnought's hull didn't rupture. Its external weapons didn't detonate. Instead, its primary navigation core, housed beneath 3 layers of phased shielding, shut down. Instantly. Artificial gravity collapsed, stabilizers stuttered, internal communications halted. The vessel remained whole, but its limbs no longer listened to its mind. 12 seconds later, 16 more impacts followed, each tailored, each precise. Cruiser-class vessels were struck across their sensor arrays. Frigates took kinetic taps along energy distribution hubs. 2 escort ships lost life support but retained hull integrity. 1 processor ship, armed with containment units meant for civilizational relocation, found its AI core fragmenting under electromagnetic ripple patterns coded into the strike vector. Not a single Aurak ship exploded. Not one was torn apart. They simply stopped functioning, as if Earth had reached into their architecture and flipped the off switches one by one. It wasn't war. It was interruption. Within those ships, crews scrambled in silence. Interfaces responded in glitched loops, or not at all. Emergency commands failed to route. Internal sensors reported inconsistent readings, oxygen levels rising and falling at random, artificial horizons misaligning, corridors looping in HUD displays like recursive mazes. Pilots couldn't orient to Earth's surface. Engineers couldn't verify reactor conditions. Weapons teams stared at blank control panels that only seconds ago had bristled with readouts. They weren't dying. They were adrift, conscious, intact, and utterly cut off. The strike pattern hadn't been based on power output, it had been based on behavioral profiling. Delphi's data crawlers had spent years studying Auroch design logic, deciphering what systems they prioritized in crisis, and the Aegir-Wake strikes had targeted those dependencies, not to destroy them, but to nullify them. If an Auroch ship needed 3 systems to maintain dominance, navigation, communication, internal logic, then only those 3 were targeted. The rest was left untouched, a ghost ship that could breathe but not move, float but not act. From the ground, there were no fireworks, no transmissions, just 17 ships, fully armed, now hanging in orbit like artifacts frozen in time. The consortium had prepared for battle, but Earth had prepared for removal. The difference wasn't philosophical, it was strategic. Destruction could be justified. Interruption could not. The Auroch weren't dealing with rebels, they were dealing with a variable that refused to function inside their framework. On Delphi channels, no celebration was logged, no confirmation sent. The launch vectors were sealed, and the wakes cooled back into geologic silence. Vorik watched the data stream from a cavern beneath the Yucatan Basin and simply muted it. The mission was done. There was nothing more to monitor. Above, the fleet remained suspended. Inside the dreadnought, backup systems attempted to reroute. Auto-recovery protocols initiated layered diagnostics, and every single one failed. Not because the systems were broken, but because they were being lied to. The strikes hadn't just crippled machinery, they had introduced false feedback loops. The ships were trapped not just by physical damage, but by doubt. Internal logic trees began rejecting their own inputs. The Auroch hadn't lost control of their fleet. They had lost trust in it. That was the final blow. They had come expecting resistance, but resistance was noisy, desperate, reactive. What they had received was a lesson in silence. Earth hadn't struck to win. It had struck to remove itself from their framework entirely. The fleet hadn't been defeated. It had been eclipsed, rendered irrelevant in a space that no longer followed the rules they had written. Orbit was quiet now. 17 ships. No movement. No threat, and from Earth not a single word. The consortium issued no formal statement. No war declaration was retracted because none had been made. In the internal registry, the event was relabeled under a low-grade data signature, Zone Interference Instability, Sector Soltu. Technical terminology, an excuse embedded in bureaucracy designed not to deceive but to allow retreat without loss of face. The term circulated briefly through non-critical channels before being archived. To those on the inside, the message was clear. Sol was now designated Red Border, High Anomaly, Low Engagement Priority. Patrol paths were rerouted. Transit corridors bent away. The Auroch fleet had not been defeated. It had simply been removed from the equation. And still, Earth said nothing. Inside the Delphi network, the conclusion was quiet and absolute. No victory celebration, no final broadcast. There were no medals, no parades, no reveals to the public. Just shutdown. The Delphi directive, having achieved its final parameter, removal of Earth from alien categorization, folded itself inward. Command threads dissolved. Access keys erased themselves. Facility caches were stripped and rendered inert. Operatives returned to civilian infrastructure, embedded within harmless bureaucracies, research divisions, and data sanitation firms. No one looked twice. There were no farewell codes, no extraction schedules. Delphi had never been built to endure. It had been built to vanish. Vorik did not return to a home. He simply stopped receiving signals. His final act was confirming the cooling of the Aegir wakes. The geothermal loops beneath Earth's crust dimmed, cycle by cycle, until they returned to background heat signatures indistinguishable from planetary noise. The Skerrit Cascade entered permanent dormancy, unrecoverable without the original access threads. He did not watch them shut down, he simply walked into the blackout. Earth's skies remained clear. In the weeks that followed, the world above resumed its rhythm, though slightly altered. Civilian infrastructure was rebooted, cities powered back up, satellites re-entered telemetry, global networks flickered online with no official explanation for the blackout. Speculation bloomed, of course, everything from solar anomalies to black market AI sieges, but nothing stuck. There were no images, no leaked videos. The only physical proof of what had occurred hung above the planet, 17 alien vessels in stable orbit, drifting like relics in silence. They did not fall. They did not burn. They simply remained. News outlets reported on them with tentative detachment, using outdated imagery and restricted access permits. No one tried to board them. No one tried to dismantle them. Whatever had happened, it was too clean to explain and too large to frame. The truth never needed to be hidden. It simply couldn't be processed. And in that void of explanation, something new emerged. A myth. Not of war, not of victory, but of refusal. Among the border worlds of the consortium, Earth became a question without an answer. A planet that had struck first and said nothing after. A species that had dismantled a fleet without showing its own. Diplomatic relays whispered the phrase, "Sol is shadowbound." Merchant vessels redirected to avoid passing its orbital arcs. Scientific dispatches quietly adjusted Earth's classification, not as primitive, but as indeterminate, unmapped, untouchable. It wasn't a threat because it had made no demands, and that absence was more dangerous than any show of force. Weeks later, a single object launched from Earth's surface. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a probe. It was a vault, sleek, unmarked, silent. It moved in a slow arc, placing itself into low lunar orbit. No defenses, no encryption. Inside was no weapon, no data key, no AI, just a capsule. And within that capsule, a plaque, unassuming, engraved with a message that required no explanation, no context, and no signature. We never claimed dominance. We only asked not to be catalogued. The Auroch never responded. There was nothing left to answer. Earth had made its position clear, not through diplomacy, not through conquest, but through absence engineered to be undeniable. Delphi was gone. The fleet was broken, and orbit, once contested, now belonged to silence. Humanity had not risen. It had vanished from the map, and in doing so had drawn a boundary even stars would hesitate to cross. What do you think humanity's greatest weapon was in this war? Technology, strategy, or silence? Would Earth's refusal have worked against another kind of enemy? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more high-stakes HFY tales, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next encounter.